So I am currently reading this book called The Rejected Body, Feminist Philosophical Reflections on Disability, and it's by Susan Wendell. I realize this is going to be backwards because of the camera, but there you guys can all see it. And so it's just such a great book. I feel like there's a lot of things that she writes about that I've thought about a lot, and so it's sort of like Susan Wendell is putting a lot of my thoughts and feelings into words, and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is so true. And I've been trying to figure out a way that I can share these these thoughts with more people. And since there's copyright issues, and since I can't just make everybody go out and buy the book and read it themselves, I decided that I'm going to do a video series in which I read small sections from the book. I say small because they're going to be small, so there are no copyright issues involved. So the selection from the book that I'm going to read today is from the chapter Disability is Difference. And this section is titled The Future of Difference. And it's sort of talking about how disability is really, well, we'll just read it. Okay. The Future of Difference. And the author refers to different parts in her book, so that's why it might sound sort of out of place. Okay. The final group of issues I want to consider in this chapter concerns the preservation of difference. If we value the differences of people with disabilities, what implications does that have for efforts to prevent or cure disabilities? Is saying everyone wants a healthy baby morally and politically similar to saying everyone wants a white baby? If not, how is it different? Is there as much reason to preserve the functional impairments and structural imperfections of human bodies as there is to preserve their genetic diversity? Feminist ecologists often urge us to value and protect the vulnerability and imperfections of nature. Should the vulnerability and imperfections of our bodies also be valued and protected, or should we attempt to transcend them? Some of these questions arise practically now in relation to medical technologies that offer genetic diagnosis to potential disabilities in a person's offspring and prenatal detection of potential disabilities in fetuses. Although I will discuss them again in Chapter 6 in relation to a feminist ethics of abortion, I want to point out here that widespread ignorance of the lives of people with disabilities, fear of disablement, and the assumption that disability is primarily a biologically determined rather than a socially constructed phenomenon contribute to the desire to prevent disability by preventing difference from the physical and mental norms of a society. To people who value disabilities as differences, attempts to prevent disability by preventing the birth of people with disabilities can seem analogous to attempts to guarantee the birth of male babies because they are more highly valued, or to wipe out color differences by genetic technologies. It might be argued that it is hard to appreciate disabilities as differences where disabilities have devastating social consequences. The fact is that a child born with spina bifida or Down syndrome will face many socially created obstacles to living well. Of course, the same thing is true for children of color in white-dominated societies, but few people of color would argue that it is a sufficient reason not to bring a child of color into the world. Rather, it would be argued it is a reason to fight for just treatment of people of color. I think we have to admit that it is the fact of physical and/or mental difference, usually perceived as abnormality or pathology, that makes it seem so much more obvious to many people that potential disability is a sufficient reason not to bring a child into the world. Moreover, unlike children of color in white-dominated societies who are most often born into families or communities of people of color, children with disabilities are not usually born into a family or community of people with disabilities who are already committed to valuing their differences and fighting for their rights. At best, adults thinking of parenting a child with disabilities know they will have to find or create a community of support for themselves and their child. At worst, They believe that they will have to cope on their own. If they are afraid of the burden of raising a child with a disability in a society where accessibility and help are far from adequate, they have reason to be afraid. Another consideration enters into questions about the practical implications of valuing disabilities as differences. How much physical and/or mental suffering is inherent in the difference itself, that is, how much suffering that could not be eliminated by any social arrangements, no matter how supportive they might be to the lives of people with disabilities. Part of what is at work in the sentiment, everyone wants a healthy baby, is a desire that children be spared suffering. Although ignorance of disability probably exaggerates the physical suffering and underestimates the social suffering of most people with disabilities in the minds of people without disabilities, the importance of uneliminable suffering must not be overlooked. Even people with disabilities who identify strongly with being disabled and have very happy, fulfilling lives might want to be cured, not for social reasons, but because they want to have less pain or physical or mental difficulty. Who can and should answer the question, is the suffering too high a price to pay for the difference? Certainly people with disabilities who have intimate knowledge of the suffering involved in a disability and who also have sufficient experience to know and value the differences it makes possible are better qualified to answer this question than others. Yet even for them, this may be a hard question to answer, especially since the social components of the suffering of many people with disabilities, such as loneliness, alienation, poverty, constant blows to self-esteem, and frustration due to lack of accessibility and services are hard to separate clearly from the socially ineliminable physical and/or mental components. Difficult circumstances make both physical and mental suffering worse and harder to bear. These factors are likely to cause error on the yes side of the question, but not, I think, as much error in that direction as the ignorance and fear of most people who have little or no experience of disability. Like the development of technologies to prevent people with disabilities from being born, the drive to find cures for disabilities can be seen by those who appreciate disabilities as differences to be as much an attempt to wipe out difference as an effort to relieve suffering. There is so much emphasis on possible cures in biomedical talk and charity talk, and indeed most talk about disability, and so little recognition of the potential and value of disabled people's actual lives that this interpretation of motives is justified. The widespread message that they are not good enough until they are cured places the self-respect of people with disabilities in conflict with any desire to be cured. I find that my own resistance to the attitude that I need to be cured in order to be a whole or fully acceptable person infuses my desire for a cure with ambivalence. I want to have more energy and less pain, and to have a more predictable body. About that, there is no ambivalence. Moreover, I feel heartsore when I hear about someone being diagnosed with ME. That's the disease this author has. How could I not want to hear for anyone else who suffers with it? Yet I cannot wish that I had never contracted ME, because it has made me a different person, a person I am glad to be, would not want to have missed being, and could not imagine relinquishing, even if I were cured. For example, I cannot imagine that I would ever stop identifying myself as a person with a disability. And when I think about the probability that others would stop identifying me as one if I were cured, it is hard to imagine how I would deal with the dissonance. Perhaps the best summary of my attitude toward cure is this: I would joyfully accept a cure, but I do not need one. If this attitude toward cures were taken for granted in my society, then the search for them would not be accompanied by insulting implications as it often is now. People who take it for granted that it would be a good thing to wipe out all biological causes of disability as opposed to social ones are far more confident that they know how to perfect nature and humanity than I am. Even supposing that everyone involved in such an effort were motivated entirely by a desire to prevent and alleviate suffering, What else besides suffering might we lose in the process? And would they know where to stop? Certainly, those who do not value the differences of people with disabilities cannot be trusted to decide where to stop trying to perfect human beings. Promises to eliminate the biological causes of disability assume that some culturally neutral biomedical definition of disability can be agreed upon, and they obscure the fact that disability is socially constructed from physical and mental difference. What would it mean then, in practice, to value disabilities as difference? It would certainly mean not assuming that every disability is a tragic loss, or that everyone with a disability wants to be cured. It would mean seeking out and respecting the knowledge and perspectives of people with disabilities. It would mean being willing to learn about and respect ways of being and forms of consciousness that are unfamiliar. And it would mean giving up the myths of control and the quest for perfection of the human body. And again, this is the book, The Rejected Body, Feminist Philosophical Reflections on Disability by Susan Wendell. And yes, hope you enjoyed. I'll read more soon.